Voices. My name is Trudy Peterson. I coordinate this for the village. Let me do a little bit of the rules of the road. First of all, I want to thank Mae Jean Daniels for doing the publicity as she always does for us. Thanks to Mary Bloodworth, who's providing tech support for us tonight. And of course to Judy Berman, who runs the whole Village Voices for us. Do note that we are recording this session, so whatever you say, we will be recording and posting. We will have about half an hour of discussion after the talk. I'll try to cut it off right at 8 o'clock so that we all know we can go about the rest of our lives. We will take questions either by the raised hand functions or questions typed into the chat. As we go along, if you think of a question and you want to make sure you remember it, I encourage you to use the chat function. We'll take all the questions out of chat when we get to the end of the first presentation. Okay, let me also go through what we are doing this autumn. In October, on October 4, our speaker will be Patsy Sims. Patsy's been following the work of the Ku Klux Klan for over 40 years. And she's going to talk about the Klan, its current manifestation, and how it links to other far-right groups that we are seeing. That's October 4, it's a Monday. The October 8, we will have retired diplomat Avis Bolin, who has a wonderful personal story in her own right, but she's writing a biography of her father, Charles Bolin. Charles was a diplomat extraordinaire in the middle part of the 20th century. He was at Yalta with the Big Three before the end of World War II. He was at the convening meeting in San Francisco of the United Nations, what became the United Nations. He was ambassador of 4 countries, should be a wonderful discussion. And then on December 6th, we have Ellen Farrell, who is the founder and organizer of Capitol Hill Early Music. And she's going to enliven us for the holidays by talking about early music from the Renaissance and give us some excerpts from it to take us into the holiday season. So I encourage you to join us for all those upcoming programs.
That's a great lineup. I just have to say, Trudy, that's a wonderful lineup. It really is.
Okay, so now let me encourage you all to mute yourselves, and we will turn to Elizabeth Becker. Elizabeth was with us a couple of years ago talking about her previous book, which was a wonderful book on the impact of travel around the world, and especially vacation travel and what it's doing to countries and economies, but also to climate. It was a book that I thought should have gotten a lot more attention than it did, and I've been very grateful that Elizabeth wrote that one. I approached her new book and was very surprised. It's a very different book, and in which she is telling basically biographical stories of 3 very important women. Now, right now, we've all probably watched Christiane Amanpour when she was in the Balkans during the Balkan Wars. Recently, we've been seeing the extraordinary reporting of Clarissa Ward out of Kabul as the Taliban was taking over. And yet these women would not have probably had the same chances were it not for Elizabeth and the 3 women she's going to talk about tonight. Elizabeth herself was, of course, a journalist in Cambodia at the end of the Vietnam War, and she knew all 3 women she's writing about. It's probably a book no one else could have written, and yet without her initiative to take it on, we would be poorer. So with that, Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Judy. Trudy, you're as generous as ever. And it's lovely to be talking to my neighbors. like everybody, we've been Zooming all over the world, and it's so much fun to be talking to neighbors who hear the same airplane go over their heads, and and I can see at least one other member of St. Mark's Church, and I'm with family. Anyway, yes, it's true. I chose to write a biography of these three women because it was a missing link in our history as women and also as journalists and of the war. When the Vietnam War started, women were banned from ever covering the combat field. They had never been allowed. Women were not hired by news media to do much more than be researchers. So the idea of a woman war correspondent was an oxymoron. These three women from three different countries, three different continents, for very different reasons, decided that they wanted to, on their own, go and try to become correspondents with no support whatsoever. And I mean no support. To take you back, 1966, I'll start with the French photojournalist Catherine Leroy. She didn't even finish her baccalaureate in high school. She was a rebel from the get-go. She was barely 5 feet tall. She had trouble keeping her weight up to 100. She was a classic pianist, rebel against her petite bourgeois family in the Paris suburbs, and a taste for adventure and a taste for importance. She worked at a temp agency in Paris to save enough money to buy a ticket to Saigon. Now, of course, being French, she'd grown up with Indochina and with the whole idea of Saigon and Hanoi, and this was part of her education. And she grew up in a family that was very much to the right. So she arrived in Saigon with a superficial but very strong idea that the French had been right. But she also had no training. So here she is, 1966, one Leica camera to her name, and she had tied it around her neck with a shoelace. And she had walked into Saigon with nothing, not even an apartment, not a job, nothing. She had one letter from a photo agency that said maybe they would buy some of her photographs. That's it. 1966. She's 21 years old. She walked into the Associated Press, which did not have women photographers, and said, I want to be a photographer. Fortunately, the head of the bureau was an extraordinary man named Horst Voss, German, who had won a Pulitzer himself for war photography in Vietnam. He said, we don't have women. You can take some pictures of society around Saigon. And she said, no, I want to be a war correspondent. And he said, well, I do have a policy of buying any photograph that's good, no matter who takes it. So I guess I would take it from a woman. And that's how she got into the business. She had to work all on her own. She had to teach herself not just photography, but English. She did speak English. She learned it from the Marines. So it was it was a rather vulgar English that she learned. And she had to figure out how to be in the combat zone, even though it was against the rules. She did that with the help of a couple of other women who had done similar things. They figured out how to get around the American rules because President Johnson, some of you are old enough to remember this, refused to call this a war and refused to ask for permission to fight the war. Instead, so none of the old rules, all the rules were suspended. Any journalist could go anywhere. Whereas in World War II, journalists had to be embedded with a unit where the equivalent of an American military uniform and have all their copy, all their articles and all their copy and photographs censored None of that took place in Vietnam because we supposedly weren't at war. So that was great for every journalist because all you had to have is a little credential, ask a commander to allow you to get on a helicopter to go cover a unit, then come home. That was it. And also, which no one realized at the time, this was a rare opening for women because the other rule against women was suspended. So these women figured out how just to go along and keep quiet. Nobody would pay attention to them. And so Katrine did that. She got to know different commanders. They allowed her to come. And because she was not trained, because no one had told her how to take photographs, she took unusual photographs. She decided that the best photograph was the photograph where you could see the people's eyes. Now, in a photo studio, that makes sense. In a war, that doesn't, because you have to get very close and take a lot of risks. She was so small that she was able to do that sort of like an acrobat. And within a few months, she was taking photographs that everybody wanted to publish. And her colleagues, her male colleagues, were getting jealous. And so that's the third problem. Besides the normal military ban against women and the media not wanting to hire them, they would have to be freelance and take their luck. The colleagues didn't want her there. And I have all kinds of quotes from the men saying women didn't belong there. They're the ones who I quoted for the title. And within a few months of Katrine becoming a very popular and successful photographer, her colleagues went behind her back to try to get her thrown out of the country. I had to do a Freedom of Information Act through National Archives, which we all know out in Maryland, and got her file to see exactly how they had double-crossed her. They had gone to the US military and said, oh, she's vulgar, she swears, she uses her elbows, she's too aggressive. Now that would, of course, that's what all reporters are, but they were men. And a woman was supposed to be ladylike, and she wasn't. So she initially got her credentials taken away from her. I promise you, I looked for another example of this and I couldn't find it. I mean, this was a betrayal of a first order. So she initially lost it, but she fought back, she retained it. And then, and her photography just got better and better. And she was setting a whole new standard of taking photographs that weren't necessarily the heroic pose. They were the soldiers who were tired. They're the soldiers who were afraid. And one series that made her name was she went to a battlefield and she was the only reporter there, male or female. I mean, not male or female, but reporter or photographer. And she slid around in the mud and saw a young medic trying to revive a soldier who was wounded. So he's working away and she's clicking away. It's like a moonscape kind of landscape. The soldier dies and the medic lifts his head and cries out in anguish. Then he screams and he's angry and he runs to the foxhole where the enemy is and tries to kill them. This series was published around the world and she became Katrine Leroy. It's about the same time another woman reporter, didn't become famous, but was a nice reporter. She was a freelancer from Hawaii. And like the others I'm going to mention, nobody would hire her. So she had to pay her own way, get there and start doing freelance. So she was doing freelance when all of a sudden, General William S. Warland, the commander of all US Armed Forces in Vietnam, came to visit the unit she was covering. And just by chance, which is what we love when we're historians writing books, he knew her. His wife played tennis with her mother in Honolulu. You can't make this stuff up. And General Westmoreland said, Denby, her name's Denby Fawcett. Denby, what are you doing here? And she said, I'm covering this unit. And he said, well, how long have you been here, Denby? And she said, 3 or 4 nights. He said, oh, thank you. He went back to Saigon furious because he had not realized that by suspending all the rules that also allowed for an opening of women, because there's so few women who were doing it that it hadn't reached the his high level. So he was furious. He said, "What are these women doing? We're not supposed to have them." And everybody said, "Calm down. They haven't caused any problem." He said, "Well, they're going to cause problems." So they had to work out a compromise that the women promised not to ask for any special favors. Of course, they never did anyhow. And they were allowed to stay. And they knew that this was a big deal. So they kept it quiet. And they didn't tell this story for 30 years. It's all, in those days, you did not have your own website and say, "I'm cool, I'm cool." It was the opposite. When you finally broke through, you kept it quiet because they were convinced that if this got all the way back to Washington, some member of Congress or somebody's going to say, "No, we can't have this." So that's how they did it. And I opened the book with one of the most amazing things that Katrine did. She, when she was bored back in Paris before she came to Saigon, she went with her boyfriend, excuse me, to learn how to jump parachute. And she had a high rank, the equivalent of a black belt. And when she got to Saigon, she applied for permission to jump whenever Americans jumped. Well, there's only one airborne assault throughout the whole war. And she was the only journalist chosen to be on it because she was the only one qualified. So here's this little bitsy woman with all these huge Americans. And she jumped. Her uniform was bigger than she was. The parachute practically fell over her. She had cameras flying in her face, but she took amazing photographs. And I've since gotten letters from a couple of men who are still alive who saw her and thought that she must have been the colonel's daughter, because why else would anybody be allowed to do that? But her photographs are still, they're classics. They were the first and last airborne. So that's Katrine. She became, to show you her impact, she's the first woman to ever receive the George Polk Award for Photography, and the first woman to ever receive the Robert Capa Gold Medal for Photography, and you can't get any higher than that. The next one is Frances FitzGerald, an American. And she's the Great Gatsby kind of character in this story. She's from one of the most privileged backgrounds you can imagine. High WASP, the Plymouth Rock, the whole thing. Anglican bishops, money, Groton, Radcliffe, the whole thing. And her childhood was a mansion in Great Britain, chauffeurs, maids, and boarding school, Foxhall, and with her own horse. A life where she didn't know even upper middle class people, much less people who struggle. Graduated with honors from Radcliffe and I forgot to mention that also her family was totally plugged into politics. Her dad was number 3 at CIA, and her mother was the very not secret mistress of Adlai Stevenson. Just all kinds of connections. So here she is, and she applied to Newsweek after she graduated because she decided she wanted to be a reporter writer. And they said, no. Women are not qualified to be reporters or writers. They're only qualified to be researchers. That's how long, that's how much has changed. And so she went and, like everybody else, wanted to try to write a novel in Paris. That didn't work. She came back and the Vietnam War had started, 65. She tried some freelancing in New York. Her mother had a cocktail party where she introduced her to some great editors. And so Frankie was able to do some freelancing, but she was never going to get a real job. She had a horrible affair and she wanted to do something important. So she decided, now she had a trust fund. So she was able to buy a ticket to Saigon. Essentially nothing waiting for her either. She had some letters from Vogue and Village Voice. That's not, the mainstream. And she, like Katrine, had no real training for this. I mean, she was a magna cum laude from Radcliffe, but she'd never written much on other than soft profiles, and certainly didn't know Asia. But she also had to make it up. And she decided she was not going to do just bang, bang combat. She was going to look at the whole country. And she was not going to write as if she were part of the American administration, which in those days reporters did. They talked about our boys and that sort of stuff. And she was not going to do that. So right from the beginning, she wrote very different articles. She wanted to know what the Vietnamese were doing, what the Vietnamese thought of the Americans, and how did that match what the Americans were saying to the press. She, within months, was writing stuff that no one else was writing. And she was, everybody thought she would have no problem covering, getting good sources in the US Embassy, because her father, Desmond FitzGerald, was so high up in the CIA. In fact, he had been the creator of the first CIA war, and that was in Laos. His daughter didn't know it then. But in fact, the embassy didn't treat her particularly well either. They didn't take her, nobody took her seriously. She was like a debutante. And what was a debutante doing there? So she had to do it on her own. And once, when she was doing what turned out to be a very important story, a commander didn't believe that she was actually going to be writing a piece for the New York Times Magazine. She got a commission to do it. So he wouldn't let her on the helicopter, on the airplane, until he had patched a phone all the way to New York to make sure that she wasn't lying, because he thought this was, another ditzy Debbie. And that's what these ladies put up with. But her series of reportings led to the first that I could find in-depth piece on what it's like for villagers in one village in Vietnam to go through this war. Now that's common practice now, but it was path breaking then to look at the war. There was not a single American soldier in that story. It was, this is what it looks like when it's your country that has to go through those kinds of bombardments, that kind of being pushed around and shoved, losing your fields, losing your homes, and so on and so forth. And it led to all kinds of commissions. She eventually went back to the United States, could not give up Vietnam, and dedicated herself to writing the very first book about the war from the Vietnamese point of view, historical, social, and culture, as well as the American. And that book's called Fire in the Lake. It won it was published when she was 31. It won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the Bangkok History Prize. No book about Vietnam has won those prizes before or since. And you'd think that that would mean she would be appreciated by her male colleagues, but to this day, it's still very hard for them to accept that debutante, in fact, became Frances FitzGerald. She ended up having a good career, continuing to write. Oh, and I forgot. And the New Yorker serialized Fire in the Lake 5 parts, and that was, of all the wars, there's only one other where they had done that even more serialization. That's how seriously they took it. So she also not only broke the glass ceiling, but changed how we saw war. And the third is an Australian named Kate Webb. Now she comes from a rather privileged academic background. Her family's originally from New Zealand, where her grandfather was the Archbishop, the Anglican Archbishop of New Zealand. Her mother was a rare graduate, a master's degree from London School of Economics. She read Latin for fun. And her father was the head of the political science department in the National University of Australia. So she grew up with all kinds of intellectual stimulation. She went with her father, her sister, and her mother on a long sabbatical to Europe when she was a young teenager. She came home to Australia and had a horrible time reintegrating. And I'm telling you this story because it's really important to her in Vietnam. She and a teenage friend decided life wasn't worth living and planned a joint suicide. Kate found the hunting rifle of her dad, brought it where they were going to kill each other, kill it themselves supposedly. And her friend did, and Kate didn't. And Kate was charged with murder. The charge was later dropped, but the trauma was enormous, and it was all in the newspapers. It was awful. She somehow recovered. She was in her senior year in college, and her parents were killed in an automobile accident. So she had suffered these 3 deaths. Graduated from college, didn't know, tried to be an artist, which was her first love, and then found herself as what we would call a copy boy in an Australian newspaper, and became intrigued that Australia was joining the United States in a war in Vietnam. Just, what was this about? And it would seem to be the most important story in the world. And all 3 women knew that this was the most important story in the world. And so Kate said, what else has she got to do? She took her little portable typewriter. She was so naive, she didn't know she needed at least 1 letter of reference to get her press credentials. She arrives in Saigon, literally knows no one. And by luck, she tries to talk to different agencies, and they say, no, we don't hire women, not even for freelance. And she met the only woman editor in Saigon, who was an editor for what we then called alternative newspapers. And this woman, Anne Mariano, gave her credentials, and she started working. Well, she turned out to be, like the other 3, totally different approach than the men. Her writing was personable, intimate, and very accurate. Her breakthrough came at the Tet Offensive, January 1968, where she was one of the first reporters to get to the U.S. Embassy after it was attacked and infiltrated by North Vietnamese. And her copy was so amazing, it's still quoted in history books. Kate went on to be, she was definitely the first major combat reporter woman that I could find covering the Americans. There's no other I could find before that. Again, because of that loophole. She did so well that she eventually became the deputy bureau chief in Cambodia on the Cambodian campaign of the Vietnam War. And when her boss was killed, she became the bureau chief. And again, there's no other instance I could find like that. But no one did a press release saying, oh my gosh, look here's this woman who's doing things no other woman would do. It was not done in those days. The last thing you wanted to do is bring attention to it. And Kate, like the other 2, refused to be called a women's liberationist, which is what a feminist was called in those days. They said, no. Don't call me a women's liberationist. Don't call me a woman journalist. I'm a journalist. Because if you were called a woman anything, you were put into the ghetto and considered less than. So she's now running a bureau, multiple employees, and the war finally caught up with her, and she was captured for nearly a month in Cambodia. But fortunately, it was the North Vietnamese who were relatively kind to the journalists they captured. And they couldn't believe she was not a spy, because why would a woman be doing what you're doing? Again, I think that saved her life. She went missing, and everybody was worried because, I think maybe 2 other women had ever been captured, and it was never for very long. And there was a false report that she was dead. And it was taken so seriously that the New York Times wrote her obit. It ran. She was still alive, but they ran her obit. Her sister and brothers back in Australia, who had already suffered so much, were beyond themselves, thinking that we've lost Kate. But she came out of the jungle May 1st, and the legend of Kate Webb was born, because not only was she this amazing woman, but she just survived everything. And she went on to win awards. She wrote a book, and she, like the other two, made her name by writing personably and by including the locals, that is the Cambodians and Vietnamese and Laotians, who actually, it was their land that was being fought over. She was so good that at the time of her death, one of the best journalism prizes in Asia is named after her, the Kate Webb Prize, for the journalist who shows the greatest amount of courage and intelligence in covering wars. So these three women together are remarkable in three different fields: photography, long form journalism, and combat reporting. And that's, it was I thought, wonderful that the three best women were in three different fields. And the other, so they changed. That's why I did my subtitle, rewrote the war, because in each of those fields, they made a remarkable difference. And you see it in everyday coverage now that others hadn't done. And often they were, it was considered not good. I mean, it was like, I don't know if you know the term sob sister, which is what women were called if they wrote human interest stories. But they went beyond it, and they got over it. And they were fully engaged. And when you cover a war, that's your life. You don't have any other life. You wake up and you go to, from the time you wake up till the time you go to bed. That's all you do. It's not even reporting in some sense, because you absorb it all. And you'll always fall in love with the country because you're going through it all with them. And that was the case with them very much. And by the time the war ended in 1975, Kate had such bad PTSD. She was a barely functioning alcoholic. And she was in Hong Kong on the desks doing stuff she could do, but they would not allow her on the battlefield. Katrine had to leave for very similar reasons, and she was in the Middle East covering that war. And Frankie had just got an assignment. She finally got a visa to Hanoi. So she, in January of 75, there was Frankie in Hanoi as the final offensive began. So she wrote the exclusive on that. Then Kate talked Hong Kong into letting her go to the evacuation of Saigon, which you've all read about now, but I hope you didn't believe everything you read about that. She was the lead reporter on the evacuation when those helicopters came on the USS onto the naval ships. And then after the evacuation, Katrine had flown into Saigon from the Middle East, and she took photographs of the North Vietnamese tanks coming in. So it was perfect for my book. I couldn't make any of it up. And these are the women who are the link. Before them, no women war correspondents. After them, the Christine Amanpours automatically got their accreditation. You didn't have to hide anymore. Because of them, the ban was completely dropped. There was never a ban again. And after them, media organizations said, okay, we will send women as foreign correspondents as well as war correspondents. Before, as I just explained, you had to go there on your own and figure it all out on your own. No life insurance, nothing. After them, the next American war was in the Gulf, and Christiane Amanpour made her name. All the others did. And so that's the missing link. Those three women are that bridge. And that's why I very much wanted to write this book.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. What a terrific story. But now tell your own story, please.
So I came towards the end of the war. I was a graduate student in Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I had a friend who I met when I was studying in India. And she was one of them who tried to become a reporter and bought a ticket to Saigon. And she had landed in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And she'd been trying to get me to come out saying, drop your graduate studies. This is so much more important. And I ignored her because who in their right mind wants to go to war? And then my major professor decided he should bed me. And I said, no, I'm not having an affair with you. And lo and behold, he rejected my master's thesis and said that one did not have to do with anything to do with the other. And, blah, blah, blah. And, this is 1972. And, there's no recourse. He's a tenured professor. And there are so few of us women graduate students, nothing, there's no whatever. So I said, okay. I took my ticket, my money from my fellowship and bought a one-way ticket to Cambodia and joined my friend. And that's how I started the war. And because as I said, this was the most important story. I got there and within a few months, I was the Washington Post local reporter, NBC Radio and Newsweek stringer, because they needed it. And like the others, I had no experience, but it changed my life. And there's a lot of other stories in there that.
Okay, so let's open it up. Questions from this great group of people. Hand raise, chat box. I can't see you all at the same time, but yeah. Anyone want to ask questions?
Yes.
Yes, Lisa McCormick does.
I want to, first of all, you are amazing. And everything that you have said has been a revelation and fascinating. But I'm interested, why do you hope we don't believe everything we've read about the evacuation of Saigon? That was so intriguing to me. Tell us more.
In fact, I was just asked to write about that. When at the evacuation of Saigon, they waited so long. When an army falls apart, I mean, the North Vietnamese had no idea it would be so easy. I mean, just like that was the same, that the army that supposedly that the United States had spent all that money training and things, they both fell apart quickly. But the Americans were so reluctant to believe that that the South Vietnamese were losing, that they did not order an evacuation in time, so that the North Vietnamese were so close, they destroyed the runway. So there's no airport to land anything on. So all those helicopters, they were going from rooftops to the ships. And the Americans left before the North Vietnamese got in. So it's the exact, so they did not stay around. That's why you had all those boat people later. That was true chaos. Whereas with Kabul,
thank you.
The Kabul, they came, Biden sent reinforcements of thousands of soldiers. They landed in Kabul. They tried, it was the opposite. They came and they tried to really evacuate as many as they could. So the Saigon was truly abandonment and Kabul was an attempt to save them.
With your experience, can you comment further on Kabul and what happened? And
well, it's in terms of our policies. I don't know the Afghan culture at all. I do know, Southeast Asia, but I can say in both instances, we were using Afghanistan and Cambodia. Cambodia was part of the Vietnam War for other aims. So we supported a government that was authoritarian, not democratic. So the idea that we're saving the world for democracy, wrong. So we're supporting these authoritarian and corrupt governments. All the millions and billions that goes into it, it did not go to do what we're supposed to do. And we were not, and these governments in turn were not wonderful to the people that they were supposedly governing. So that you had corruption, authoritarianism, the opposite of human rights. And so the people, the actual citizens of either Afghanistan or Cambodia never had an alternative. So that's why they weren't supporting the Afghan, they already knew the Taliban was repulsive. And you say, well, how come they weren't out there helping to make sure Taliban doesn't come back? Well, there was no alternative. And the same thing happened in Cambodia. They didn't want the Khmer Rouge to win, but when you're faced with two choices that are so bad, and that's one of the things that all reporters will tell you on the ground, that corruption and authoritarianism can't be exaggerated of what that American policy did. You can't exaggerate it. And how, yes, there was in Kabul, definitely there's some good policies that allowed civil society to grow and it helped women. But in terms of, that the government was just, it wasn't just corrupt, corruption was the government. And the same thing,
Elizabeth.
if that's too much, but anyway.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
If I can leap in.
Sheridan's got a question. Sheridan Harvey?
Elizabeth, this was great. And I didn't know about these women except for Frances FitzGerald. So thank you. But I always thought Martha Gellhorn counted as a war correspondent. And how is she different from these women?
Okay.
Hemingway's third wife?
Oh,
Martha
I get that question every single time. And yes, she did not cover the American Army. And that's very important.
Oh, no.
That's very important. I mean, Spanish Civil War, of course. And when she wanted to cover the American Army in World War II, they put her back with the nurses. And that's the only place American women of anything could be. And so the only time she was able to do anything was she was with the nurses at Normandy, and she snuck on shore and she got caught and was sent back. And the same with Dickie Chappelle, the photographer, which is the other one that's usually brought up. The same thing. She tried to cover the Americans, where her husband was a photographer, and she tried to sneak on shore. She was caught, she was sent back because there was literally a ban. Now, she did, Martha Gellhorn later did Spain. She started out in Spain and she did other ones, but it was critical. You couldn't do the British, you couldn't do the main fighting forces in those, you couldn't do. So that's why, yes, of course she's a war correspondent, but in terms of that link where you automatically, like the Post or any other news organization, they would never have sent her, never. Because she wouldn't get the credentials.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
But thank you. I should have brought that up.
Elizabeth, you've talked about how different it is today. And yet, as you know, when the New York Times did the piece on Vietnam recently, they used one of Katrine's photos and didn't credit her. And so, how much change is there really in credit?
Well, that was not the New York Times fault. That was Getty. And they've traced that back. And Getty is famous for not always crediting the people. And they do that to men and women. I think the more interesting thing just happened about a month ago, where Le Monde newspaper, the big Parisian, the great Parisian newspaper, did a 2-page spread, 2 full pages about Katrine, the photographer we should never have forgotten. So, and I was very happy they cited my book and all that sort of stuff. They had all of her photographs and they admitted this woman should never have been forgotten and they don't want her to be forgotten again. So and they said that even when she died, they barely gave her a teeny little paragraph. So that to me said a lot, that this country, you know, because they love to be cultural, and so finally it was a great spread, and I thought it made me happy. I feel if there's no other reason for writing the book, that Katrine's been recognized by her own country.
I have something in chat asking you where you met each of these women and under what circumstances.
Very good. So Kate, when I flew from Seattle to Phnom Penh, those days you had to go a lot of different places. Kate Webb met me in Hong Kong. That's because my friend who I was staying with in Cambodia knew her, and she said, you know, my friend Elizabeth Becker's coming, please make sure she's okay. So here was my hero, Kate Webb, meeting me at the airport, which was shocking. And that's how I start my book off, in fact, saying, Kate Webb met me at the airport. And in my backpack was a book was Fire in the Lake by Frances FitzGerald. So it was quite clear that I thought I was following in footsteps. And then Kate later reported with me in Cambodia. I met Frankie FitzGerald in America, not in Vietnam. And I met Kate in Paris, not in Vietnam. But I certainly knew about, almost as soon as I got to Phnom Penh, I met two French women who were modeling themselves after Katrine, and they clued me in on who she was. And of course, everybody knew Frankie. And what was remarkable in doing this book was how open the family, Kate had died, and so has Katrine. And so Kate's family was very open. You'll see that I put all the flaws in all these women. They were fine with that. And Katrine has no family left when she died, but her friends put together all of her papers, and they were totally open with me. And then Frankie FitzGerald, I was shocked at how open she was. So you're going to get a full picture. You get all their letters home. You hear about their affairs, and the men who were creeps and the men who weren't, and how hard it was. I mean, none of these women, not these three or almost any of the others, married and had children. That was close to impossible in those days. That didn't happen. Frankie married when she was 50. The other two never married. It was, but you get and I found their journals, I found the unpublished memoirs, and for all of their talk of not being women's liberationists, in their memoirs, they admitted to all of the sexual harassment they had to put up with. But you kept that secret. You did not, because you did not want to be ostracized. Those were your colleagues. It was that, it's that era.
In the chat, there was a long comment from Mary Ronan on the evacuation out of Saigon. But since you're talking about research, can you talk a little more about your research, and not only what you were able to find, but what did you want to get that you couldn't get?
Well, what I did find was much more than I expected. I went in, I'm sure most of us, when you start a book, you know you have a really great story, you think, and you just hope you can find everything that goes with it. And in a biography, you need not just the heavy history stuff, you need the personal stuff, and you need all of the slips and stuff. And I was desperate at first because so many people who knew these women were dead. And literally some of the people who were most important, I interviewed and they died within a month or two. So overall, I had more than I could possibly want. However, I wish I had more photographs. I had, it's so hard to find video of them. And they're so hard to find stuff because we didn't have the technology then. So on the one hand, they wrote letters, which people don't do anymore. And they said things to their parents and to their friends that in their diaries. On the other hand, I don't have the living, breathing part of it. And the other thing I did was I made sure that I didn't take it for granted that the readers knew the history of the war. So that there's a spine of the history. I hope you're never lost. These women, it's all within the context, because you don't, one, because I think you have to do that, but two, you don't understand what these women went through and accomplished if you don't understand that war. So that was sometimes tricky. How to turn it into a readable, comprehensible spine, which illuminates the women's stories rather than buries them.
Trudy,
Yes.
Elizabeth,
Andrea?
could you, you were talking about, I think it's Kate that was the bureau chief in
Yeah.
Cambodia. What bureau? What?
Oh.
What?
Yes, thank you. United Press International. And,
UPI. Okay.
UPI. And you know,
Yeah.
you would have thought that AP, Associated Press, would have been more open-minded, but they were not. They didn't all through the war. No, they did not have a woman correspondent covering the war, even when it was clear they could have, they didn't. And they allowed a couple of women to report from Saigon, but not to go into the battlefield. But UPI opened the door to Kate and to others, and they were remarkable. And why, who knows? But it was United Press International. Thank you I should have said that, right?
They might have had daughters by that time.
Oh, they all had daughters, and they would say, I have a daughter and I don't want her daughter covering a war. It worked the other way.
Let
Thank
me
you.
ask Mary Ronan to talk about her comment.
Needed to. Oh, I see. Yes, yes. There were lots of back and forth. This is a question about why it took so long to evacuate. And yes, Ambassador Graham Martin did not want to evacuate, and he did not. It was it was a very common sense who wanted to be the president to lose the country and who wanted to be the ambassador to lose the country. So it was the CIA was trying very hard to. Long before Kissinger sent a memo, they couldn't get him to leave, and they finally, the CIA managed to say you had to do it. So yes, very much. Graham Martin was one of the was a big stumbling block, but a long line of American officials who did not want to be the ones who had to carry the flag out. So yes, you're absolutely right, Mary.
Let's take the Elizabeth Eby question, saying perhaps the women's admission of feminist issues allowed them even more freedom to ask or do things. So it seems like an excellent suppression of ego.
Oh, it was a protection. If you said you're a women's liberation, and I have Kate quoting in this, that means you're either ugly or you're not talented enough to get to succeed on your own. So if you did not talk about it, then hopefully you would be treated as an equal. Of course, that never happened. The freedom to ask or do things, I think, I would say that's a very good slant, and the freedom we had was with the locals, with the Vietnamese and the Cambodians and the Lao, where we were women correspondents, were not white men. We were not intimidating. We were almost like a third sex. We could go and ask questions that men, well, one, I'm not sure men even asked, but two, we could ask them and not be scary. So that is a freedom we had. And of course, talking to women, Vietnamese women, Cambodian, whatever, was much, much easier. There's a subtext, and you'll see it in the book, of, you know, I don't have to tell you how many women were put into prostitution during the war, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, we women reporters could walk in and talk and interview people and ask questions that and not frighten people. So yes, we had certain freedoms, but it had less to do with feminist issues and more with us realizing how we can fit into the culture.
Larry Minert, you've got a hand raised. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. First, thank you for a wonderful, wonderful description. I'm going to have to go read this book. But my question is that these women were obviously operating in very dangerous conditions since they were going into the war zone. Are there times when they were injured? And more broadly, are there other women who attempted to go down this path but died or were hurt? Because obviously this is just very dangerous conditions. And it seems like miraculously everybody's living.
Katrine was badly injured.
Okay.
And she survived. She was the United States military. She went to a military hospital in the Philippines, and Horst Voss, the man I praised at the beginning for buying her photographs, he made sure AP paid for it. So that was very good. Kate had minor injuries. Frankie did not have any injuries. Dickie Chappelle, who I mentioned at the beginning, who started out in World War II as a photographer with her husband, tried to cover it and was sent back. Well, by the time of the Vietnam War, she had a freelance contract and went to Vietnam and was going to be a war photographer, but she was killed within less than 2 months. She was with the Marines and stepped on somebody stepped on a mine. And she was the first woman journalist, photojournalist, still counting as journalist, the first woman journalist in history, I believe, who was killed in combat. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, proportionally, that's a lot. And a couple others were injured. Everybody got something. Illness. The illness was almost as dreadful as anything else. But that's it. That was the only. You couldn't. The rate of injury and death was not as high in Vietnam. It was higher in Cambodia. So like the first 3 months of Cambodia, as many journalists were killed as in the first 6 years of Vietnam. So it depended on your country, what years you were there and so on and so forth. But there weren't enough women that there were that many injuries.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, we're going to take 2 more questions, one out of the chat, and then Lisa McCormick has got one. But let me take the Maureen Shea, who says, in the book, they don't seem to ever interact. How did that happen?
Hi, Maureen. Hi, Ken. That's because there's so few of them. So to set the scene, Frankie FitzGerald and Katrine Leroy both come in February of 1976. As I said, Katrine's this feisty French in the battlefield all the time. And she hangs out with the photographers, which is a totally different class of journalists. And they're more likely to be smoking dope and da-da-da. Frankie is the white wine type who is with the fancy journalists. She ends up having a long-time affair with a Washington Post reporter. And the war was so big that running across each other is not likely. I mean, Saigon was big, as Maureen herself knows, she was there, and that you wouldn't run across, and everybody does not go to the press briefings because as they became known as the 5 o'clock follies, you didn't have to do it, so that's possible. And Kate, she's a combat reporter with UPI, and she's more likely to be with the their own special group of the wire service. So there were castes, and there's so few women that the women, I interviewed a lot of women, there weren't that a lot, women who actually covered the war and lived there and are still alive. I tried to talk to all of them, and they all said the most common problem was loneliness, because you didn't have women friends. You just couldn't make women friends. There were so few of you, and you're so spread out. And, you could have male friends who weren't yucky. Sexual harassment, as I said, was pretty bad, but that's not the same as having a woman friend. And that was a refrain all through the book, the loneliness.
Okay, and for our final question, Lisa, it's yours. You need to unmute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Turn to someone else because I was dying to know, and Elizabeth, thank you for answering it. I was dying to know the answer to Maureen Shea's question about, how they didn't interact. So choose someone else.
Yeah, there was no band of sisters.
Well, thank you enormously, Elizabeth. It was a wonderful, wonderful evening.
Yes.
And to all of you, please join us on October 4th when we're going to turn to the Ku Klux Klan. Stay safe, everybody, and see you in October.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Elizabeth.
Oh, hi,
Thank
Susan.
you.
Hi, Susan. Thank you.